enjoying your holidays. So today we're going to do a whole deep dive into the play. And yeah, I hope you guys find this useful. For starters, if you haven't heard of ATAR Notes before, we are your one-stop shop for free and affordable high school resources. A ton of different stuff we've got available online on the ATAR Notes website. You can download notes for basically any of your subjects or some of the texts that you're studying, like Macbeth. Lectures, we run these every school holidays, so we'll be here all throughout the year. They're totally online, and you can come back and watch the videos as much as you want all throughout the year. So register for as many as possible, no limits. And yeah, they can be great revision tools when you need to come back and go back over a concept, or you want to refresh on some of the characters and themes that we'll talk about today. Yeah, a bunch of other cool stuff to check out. There's a community where you can jump on and ask questions, and then past students like me, or even current students, will come on and chip in and say like, oh, I got a similar homework question, like here's how I did it, or take a look at my practice essay, like this is what I wrote about. There's also videos, so if you like having things explained to you audio visually, that can be a great option for, yeah, some of the big subjects. Articles, newsletters. If you sign up for the newsletter, you basically get a weekly summary of all the best bits of ATAR Notes, all the best resources, anything that's relevant to what you're learning at the moment, basically. And there's the ATAR Calc if you really want to waste a bit of time after you're done studying. So do check that out. We also have some more premium resources if you want some extra help. TuteSmart is our tutoring company. So we offer private tutoring and group tutoring, where we go through content like this, or private sessions where, for example, for English, you could bring along an essay and a tutor will be able to sit down with you on a webcam and go through it all and be like, here's how we can take this from wherever it is up to a 10 out of 10 A+. And likewise for all your other subjects. If you have homework questions, if you've got assessments or exams coming up, if there's one particular subject like me in maths where stuff just isn't getting through and you need someone to give you that extra boost, that's a great option. Study guides, the ATAR Notes books, like the physical books that you can buy on our website from our shop. You might have also seen them in like educational booksellers or things, or at your school library. You can pick those up for pretty much all the big subjects and most of the major texts, including Macbeth, if you want to have a look. Or you can look at Unlimited. I'll talk a bit about that later. That's like the Netflix for textbooks platform that we have, where you can basically access all of the available notes that we have, if you are interested. Without further ado, quick overview of what we'll cover today. If you scroll down on the page where you're watching this, there'll be a little Q&A box. I've also put up a little poll because I am curious to see where you guys are at. So fill this out if you haven't already. I totally expected most people would be in the I know nothing, it's the summer holidays, leave me alone phase. That's perfect. Today we'll be getting you up to speed so that hopefully some of you are a little bit closer to being Shakespeare geniuses by the end of it. If you already have a basic understanding of the plot and the general gist of things, you are already super far ahead of the majority of the state, so don't stress. But yeah, for all of you in the I know nothing category, welcome. I hope that by the end of this session, you'll be feeling a bit more confident. So, where was I? Yeah, please do ask me questions throughout. I will keep an eye on them as we go, so if there's anything relevant to what I'm saying, I'll clarify when I can. You can download the lecture slides below too. I might talk a little bit fast sometimes, so don't stress if you miss anything. All of the stuff on these slides will be in the little link that you can download. And like I said, this lecture, all of our lectures are always recorded. So come back, revise, watch, don't stress if you miss anything. But yeah, the whole point of us doing these live is so that, like, for you to get the most out of this, ask me questions throughout. You can even upvote other people's questions. So if someone's asked something, I can see there's a good question there already. If someone has asked something that you would also like answered, upvote that. I'll probably answer it sooner when it's closer to the top. So for example, where are we? Yeah, great question already. What is the best way to study English material? Months before, weeks before, days before? I'm going to focus on months before because this is well and truly like ahead of when I'm assuming most of you will have exams and essays due. At the months before stage, start focusing on transitioning from like primary resources to secondary resources. I don't mean primary school, secondary school. I mean, in the months before, like as you're getting to grips with the text, you shouldn't be just opening up Macbeth and looking at the pages and being like, what do I do? Where do I start? What do I look at? You want to try and take the important bits and pieces in Macbeth and turn it into like a set of notes for yourself, whether that's using another guide as a kind of basis, whether that's your own, Google Doc or workbook. Basically, you shouldn't just be looking at the raw play. You should be looking at a quote bank so that these are the important quotes I actually have to memorize. I don't have to memorize the entire play. No one does. But you do have to go through and be like, okay, what are the major characters? Let's draw a character map. That's an example of a secondary resource where you're going beyond just the raw thing itself and turning it into something useful. If you're doing all that kind of stuff months before, I'm going to go through some examples in these slides as well, so you can use them as your starting point. If you're doing that months before, you will have a way, way, way easier time in the weeks before and days before, because you'll have done all the hard work identifying what you need to know and what's going to be most useful to you, as opposed to the kids who, like, in the weeks before their exam are like, oh, maybe I should reread the play. You don't want to be doing that at that stage. You want to be thinking, all right, I've already got a good grip on my interpretation. How can I construct essays and start practice essays? So yeah, months before, don't write essays, prepare resources, prepare your mind. In the weeks before, that's when it's like, all right, let's put myself to the test, see how I do with practice essay plans and practice essays. And then days before, honestly, just chill. In the days before the exam, you're not going to make a massive difference to your mark, and you don't want to. The aim is to be so sufficiently prepared that you can afford to take it easy and just do a quick refresh over your notes, maybe a few essay plans, and that should suffice. I also wanted to say that this lecture today is specifically about Macbeth, but we have a ton of other English lectures for different states and different year levels. So if you have more questions that are kind of, how do I write an introduction, or what's the best way to do a practice essay and improve my marks, those lectures, if you haven't registered for them, you can still do it now and watch the videos afterwards. But all the other lectures this week will be targeted to your specific state, year level, like your specific English subject. So you can jump in and ask those lecturers questions about like more general English stuff. One last thing, I've gone through and highlighted the words in these slides that I think are good Macbethy vocab words to use. I don't expect you to have known of these beforehand. Like, often these are words that students will look up throughout the year because their teachers might start using them. So I've highlighted them here so you can pay attention and be like, all right, weird word, how can I use this? But I've used them in a sentence so that hopefully it's clear how and why they will be useful to you in analysing and describing the text. Alrighty, so topics that we'll go through today. I'm going to start with a plot summary, which is where it sounds like everyone is at. So we'll spend a decent amount of time explaining who's who, what's what happens and why. Then I want to introduce you to my primary interpretation of the text. I know it's really frustrating in English when your English teachers are like, oh my God, it's so deep and so meaningful. And you're like, okay, but what's it like? Why? What is the author trying to say? Give it to me straight. That's what I'm going to try and do, even though like all Shakespeare plays and like most English texts, this is really, really multi-layered, multifaceted. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can talk about for Macbeth. So I am not presenting this as the only approach by any means, but it's the one that like got me through studying the text and what I hope will be useful to you as well. Then the main thing I want to focus on is character analysis, because this is a very character-driven play with some of Shakespeare's richest and like most famous characters. If you understand them and their motivations and what happens to them, the other parts of the text will much easier, will be able to slot into place a lot easier. So speaking of slotting into place, I'll cover what I think are the most important key themes. However, the themes of books interrelate with one another. It's impossible to just look at the theme of revenge as a sole kind of unit in and of itself without linking that to themes of ambition, themes of power, themes of aggression, and related ideas. So we'll look at the main ones and think about how they connect, because that'll give you a much more solid web of understanding for approaching different types of essay questions and prompts and all that jazz. Then language features. So won't spend a whole lot of time on that today. I'll try and get to essay structure because I know that's a thing that stresses people out a lot too. But language features are the like building blocks of your essays when it comes time to analyze. So I'm just going to highlight some language features that I think are important, and then we'll go through a few examples of like how you could annotate parts of the text and what sorts of things you should look for. But yeah, it's honestly a really fun play. I know no one likes reading Shakespeare, and I'm not going to suggest that you do so, but there are some really profoundly clever uses of language that are fun. I know English nerd, but are fun to discuss and analyze and unpack. And there are some surprisingly comedic moments, like this guy Lennox rocks up and is like, "Oh, the night is unruly. Oh, look, behold these storms at the window, prophesying with accents terrible. Oh my god, it was all that the earth was feverish and did shake." And Macbeth's like, "Yep, 'twas rough." Clearly not having any of it, There are some really interesting, relationship dynamics and stuff that you can unpack and explore. And obviously this doesn't translate well when you're just reading it on the page, which is why if you can manage to see a performance of Macbeth, or if you can watch productions or watch sometimes film adaptations, but some of them can play a little fast and loose with the original, that's where you can get a real sense of wow, Macbeth is a really psychologically complex character, as is Lady Macbeth, as are a bunch of the others in the play. Finally, essay structure. So basically, hopefully, so that this doesn't happen to you, we'll go through ways that you can go from the text itself to ideas on the page and brainstorming what's important for each major section of the essay. So first, I will give you my they're long sentences, but 2-sentence summary of Macbeth. If you understand these 2 sentences, again, that's our foundation for everything that we'll talk about today. First sentence, I warned you they were long. Macbeth is a Scottish lord who, the term for that is a thane in this period of England, who receives a prophecy from 3 witches that he will be king. So Macbeth proceeds to commit murder, commit to murder, kill Duncan, his own best friend Banquo, and countless others to make the prophecy come true. And in all of this, he is spurned on by his ambitious and power-hungry wife. So Macbeth is told when 3 witches rock up, "You are one day going to be king." Macbeth is like, "That's a great idea. I should make that happen." He kills King Duncan, and so in doing so, he steals the throne for himself. In stealing the throne, he then creates kind of disorder in the kingdom, and everyone starts to get suspicious. His best friend Banquo, who was also there when Macbeth met the witches, Banquo realizes what's going on, and also Banquo gets a prophecy of his own that says, when the witches are like, "Banquo, you are not going to be king, but your sons will be king," which Macbeth, once he is king, realizes is a threat, because it means Banquo's sons might try and kill Macbeth. So Macbeth commits to killing Banquo, despite them being supposedly best friends. And there are a bunch of others who get in Macbeth's way. In the end, Macbeth and his wife are driven mad by guilt. Lady Macbeth, who's the power-hungry one who's like, "Yeah, do it, go, stab." Lady Macbeth commits suicide at the end. It's debatable, but that's the general interpretation. She dies, nevertheless. And Macbeth is beheaded by the rebels who reinstate Duncan's son, Malcolm, as the rightful heir to the throne. So King Duncan's son, Malcolm, runs away at the start because he's like, "Oh, heck, someone's killed my dad. I'm probably next." But he comes back at the end alongside Macduff, who supports Malcolm in trying to reclaim the throne, because Macduff was very loyal to King Duncan. There are lots of M names, don't stress, we'll try and keep them straight as we go. But yeah, this is a cautionary tale about ambition, about power lust, about greed, and about what it takes to be king, what it means to be king. And the other layer to this is the idea of prophecy. If I tell you something will be true and you make it true, was my prophecy right? Or were you the one acting on that knowledge and bringing things into fruition? The key concepts that I want you to be aware of and to look out for as you go through summary videos online or as your teacher starts talking about the text. First of all, like I said, ambition, power, greed. That's a big driving force behind the character of Macbeth, and it's also something that's important for a bunch of the other characters too. Appearances versus reality. This comes in with both the main characters and the witches, the supernatural characters. Supernatural, prophecy, fate. Like I've said, yes, that's the witches, but it's also the idea of destiny and whether anything is set in stone or it's all, written in the stars. Guilt, madness, paranoia. Particularly, and pretty much exclusively for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as the two characters who really suffer the consequences of their actions, but also, yeah, endure a lot of psychological torment. It's quite hard to watch. So even though Macbeth is the protagonist, he is the main character, he is the eponymous character, he's who the play is named after, but it's hard to say he is a out-and-out hero or villain. We'll get to this later when we do a character analysis, but he is more of an anti-hero, more of a tragic hero than someone we really want to root for, or someone we necessarily want to see fail, because we can see in him the essence of a good person at the start, but that just becomes corrupted by ambition, by prophecy, and he's sort of led astray. Finally, there are some themes of masculinity and femininity. This is almost unique I shouldn't say unique, it's rare for Shakespeare plays to explicitly examine this for reasons we'll get into. But basically, Lady Macbeth is probably one of the best, most complex women in Shakespeare, female characters. So a whole lot we can unpack with her as we go. If you are in that I know nothing about the play category, I would recommend checking out this very good video from a YouTube channel called Dr. Aiden, where he gives you basically a scene-by-scene summary. I'll leave the link there so you can go watch it later. But basically, he's broken things down into 5 for each of the 5 acts. 5 roads to something. Basically, what is each act leading up to? At the start, we have the road to temptation, where Macbeth is tempted by the prophecy and tempted into killing Duncan. We have road to the crown, where he is committing Duncan's murder and usurping, taking the crown for himself. Then we have the road to insecurity in Act 3, where he starts to descend into madness and paranoia and suspect everyone around him, everyone's trying to steal my throne and Banquo's kids are going to kill me, I just know it. And you start to see the psychological unraveling of Macbeth. We have the road to tyranny, where he starts sowing the seeds for committing war crimes, killing innocent people's families. We'll get into it. It's a whole bloodthirsty play. Tyranny meaning an abuse of power, a tyrannical leader who does whatever he wants to meet his own ends and doesn't care about his people or his subjects. And then finally, road to death, which is Macbeth's demise and the culmination of the play, which is that Macbeth is on this tragic journey, and it's inevitable that he ends up here because of how things have progressed. You can also see the scene breakdown is a little bit strange in this play. There's a lot happens in Act 5, but a lot of these scenes are very short, and so it contributes to this jarring effect where you're jumping between the battle and the castle and the Macbeth's camp and the rebel camp with Malcolm and Macduff. Whereas Act 4, some of these earlier acts are where you get longer scenes and more psychological pondering, where the characters are either engaging in conversations with each other or soliloquies, where they're just talking to the audience and no one else is on stage. And the characters are talking about their psychological grief or their state of mind. All right, so let's go through our own plot summary here. King Duncan is the ruler of Scotland, King of Scotland. That won't last more than an act or 2. And Macbeth is currently the Thane of Glamis, which is the British royal family has the Queen, the head of state, and then they have the Prince of York, Prince of Edinburgh, Prince of whatever. So the Queen's children in a specific order have specific land allocated to them. They're not technically King Charles isn't in charge of Wales really necessarily, but back in these days, kings were much more like politicians. They were the leaders of the country. They weren't just sort of figureheads. So Macbeth is the Thane of a place called Glamis. You don't need to know what that means. It's just a region in Scotland. And then Macbeth and Banquo, after a battle where they're fighting on behalf of King Duncan, they come across 3 witches who prophesize that Macbeth will become Thane of Cawdor, so a better plot of land. It's going from, he was once the Thane of Tasmania, but he will now be the Thane of Sydney. Ooh, we get to the Opera House, right? So that's an upgrade. But the witches then prophesize that he will later be king and he will be president of the world, and that goes to Macbeth's head quite quickly. The witches also tell Macbeth's friend Banquo that Banquo isn't going to be king, but Banquo's sons will be king. And at this point, Banquo is very skeptical. Banquo is the cleverer of the two, for start. And Banquo is well, give me proof of this if it's going to be true. And the witches are like, woo, it'll happen one day. And Banquo's like, I don't know about any of this. But Macbeth is just like, they said I could be king? I could be king. Oh my God, imagine if I was king. Meanwhile, Banquo's like, dude, they've given you no proof. They're just a pack of witches and they're really ugly. We'll get into it. But the witches are like, they're also called the Weird Sisters. And they're, even though some adaptations of Macbeth depict them as like these really sexy temptresses who lead Macbeth astray, in the original play, they're meant to be super ugly. I think at one point Banquo straight up says like, your visage prevents me from thinking you are women. Basically, you look like super old, ugly men. What are you doing? Like, what do you want from us? So yes, Banquo is the more skeptical, the more credulous character who doesn't necessarily just jump in, you know, jump off a bridge without knowing how many rocks are in the river below kind of character. He's got his wits about him, but he is also curious about this notion of, oh, like my sons are going to be king. That's interesting. But he doesn't start plotting in the same way that Macbeth does, like almost instantly. Then Macbeth holds a feast at his castle for the king in Inverness, when you see that word in play. And he tells his wife, Lady Macbeth, about the prophecy. As soon as Lady Macbeth hears it, she's like, hey, you could be king. Wouldn't that be so great for us? Like, I would love it if you were king. And she is arguably one of the driving forces, sorry, not arguably, she is definitely one of the driving forces behind Macbeth. You could argue that she is the driving force behind Macbeth. Because Macbeth is tempted by the prophecy. Lady Macbeth is like, we're going to make this happen. Step 1, step 2, step 3. She's the one who really sets things in motion and forces Macbeth to commit the first murder, which is the murder of King Duncan. Because in order for Macbeth to be king, Duncan has to go, and Macbeth has to steal the throne from him. When we talk about the background information in a second, I'll tell you a little bit about the real King Duncan, but for the most part, like, you don't have to know the real history that this is loosely based on, because it's not taken directly from history. Like, Shakespeare changed things up. One of the big things he changed was that in reality, Duncan wasn't a great king, and so Macbeth stealing the throne to some people would have been like a decent option. In this play, King Duncan is a good king, and so it's really offensive that Macbeth rocks up, stabs him in secret, and steals the throne for himself. And it's basically more likely to lead to rebellion, and it makes Macbeth a bit more of a villainous anti-hero, because Duncan's just a very trusting, nice guy. So yeah, Macbeth holds a feast in his castle. Initially, this isn't really with the intention of killing him instantly, but the fact that Macbeth kills King Duncan while Duncan is invited to his home and like trusts him and is under his roof. There's a term in Game of Thrones for this, but the right of safe harbor, like safe passage. If you invite me into your home and you stab me, you're committing like an extra level of, you know, crime, because I trusted you enough to rock up and like sit down and have dinner with you. So yeah, just makes it extra, it's kind of additionally antagonistic, or like also shocking to the audience while they're watching this. So Macbeth's reluctant at first, but Lady Macbeth persuades him to kill King Duncan. Whoops, sorry, I missed a word there. Macbeth is then crowned king because he has killed the previous king, and he blames the murder on 2 innocent servants. So Macbeth kills King Duncan in the dead of night, and then in the morning when his body is discovered, Macbeth rocks up and is like, Macbeth, who finds the body? Macduff, I think, finds the body and is like, don't look, Lady Macbeth, it's too horrifying for a woman's eyes. And Lady Macbeth faints because she's like, oh no, a dead body, I can't believe it. Macbeth then rocks up and he's like, this is so shocking. Don't worry, guys, I've already killed the 2 people responsible for it. And they're like, you already killed them? He's like, yeah, they totally confessed, they did it, and I've stabbed them, the servants are over there, I've already killed them, it's all sorted. And already Macduff, who discovers the body, is like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Later, to retain the throne, so now that the paranoia starts to set in and Macbeth's like, who's going to try and take this from me now? Like, I've just killed the king, therefore, as the new king, I can also be killed. What do I have to look out for? Where are the threats coming from? So Macbeth murders Banquo, and he tries to kill Banquo's son, because that's what the prophecy was, remember? The sons are going to be king. So he kills Banquo, so Banquo can't have any more sons. And as part of this same murder plot, he tries to murder his son. Interestingly, this time, Macbeth commissions like 3 murderers to commit this crime. He doesn't do this one himself. Macbeth kills King Duncan, but he orders the deaths of Banquo and Fleance, but Fleance escapes. And so at this point, if we're thinking back to the theme of prophecy and fate, we don't see Fleance at all for the rest of the play, but the reason why Shakespeare has Fleance escape is because, and this will be explained a bit more in the background very soon, at the time that Shakespeare was writing this play, the King of England was King James I. He was also King James VI of Scotland, not important. King James I of England is, he claimed that he, King James, was a descendant of Fleance and Banquo. So it made Shakespeare look really good in the king's eyes if he told a story in which King James's ancestors, relatives from the play is written in the 1600s, set in the 1100s, right? So Shakespeare's telling a story about how in the 1100s, the current King James, his ancestors were noble and brave, like Banquo and Fleance are really good characters, and it also leaves open this possibility that destiny and the gods want Fleance and his line, his dynasty, to be king. So King James would have been watching this and be like, yeah, you go Fleance, you go great-great-great-grandfather, escape, we'll get him one day. So yeah, I'll talk in more detail later about why Shakespeare wanted to get and stay in the king's good books, but that's the political reason behind why he would have written that. Next, Macbeth is haunted by Banquo's ghost. So after ordering Banquo's murder, he sees Banquo again at a feast, and the ghost sits in Macbeth's chair and freaks him out. No one else can see the ghost, but everyone else can see Macbeth freaking out because he is tormented by what he's done. And that kind of marks the really big turning point in his descent into madness and paranoia. Then Macduff, who was previously on the same level as Macbeth, he was like Thane of somewhere else, and Duncan's eldest son, Malcolm, so that was the character I mentioned before, Macduff and Malcolm team up and rebel against Macbeth, and they raise an army to try and take back the throne because they work out, it wasn't super hard, that Macbeth killed Duncan, and they don't believe Macbeth is a good king. Macduff and Malcolm end up having quite an interesting relationship. So arguably the good guys that are trying to restore order and do the right thing. We'll talk about them in a bit too, but those are two characters that a lot of people ignore because they just write essays about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and they're important too, but there's a lot you can say about the secondary characters or, the supporting cast. In one of the most outrageous elements of a Shakespearean play, Macbeth orders the murders of Macduff's family. So Lady Macduff and her child, who's just called Boy in most scripts, Macbeth sends murderers to go kill them. There's a lot of murder in Shakespeare, but it's almost always murders in battle or murders that have a personal point to them, like in Hamlet, where the characters all have these really complex family relationships. It's rare in Shakespeare that innocent women and children are slaughtered, and this is described and presented as a very brutal murder. So even though up until this point you could argue, oh, Macbeth is such a tragic hero and we sympathize with him for how his fatal flaws led him down this wrong path, when it gets to this point it's okay, Macbeth's become quite a bad dude. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth is hallucinating blood on her hands. This is where the classic idea that's all over, literature and TV and stuff nowadays of, blood on your hands, literally having blood on your hands. The expression is derives from this idea of her hallucinating the blood. Even though she hasn't committed any murders herself, she's been so instrumental that her brain knows you have their blood on your hands. You are implicated, you are guilty. She's driven mad with guilt for her role in the murders, predominantly the murder of King Duncan, because that's where she really started to slip. She didn't know about the murder of Banquo. This is kind of when Macbeth goes off on his own horse and commits his own, has his own adventures in murder. But yeah, Lady Macbeth is wrecked with guilt. Then, for reasons that we'll talk about when we talk about prophecy, Macduff's army rocks up, sneaks up on Macbeth. I'll come back to the disguise thing, don't worry. Macduff and Malcolm, their army sneaks up on Macbeth, and Macbeth is killed by Macduff. Macduff beheads him, and gives the crown to a young Prince Malcolm, and then the play ends with Malcolm being like, thanks guys, this has been rough, order is restored, don't worry, I'll be king now, I'll be a good king, take a bow. So, yeah, the disguise thing, this comes from a prophecy that I've skipped because the prophecies get quite complicated and scenes with the witches are sometimes a bit hard to untangle. After the murder of Banquo, Macbeth goes back to the witches deliberately and is like, hey, I need you to tell me, like, things are going to be okay, right? You can see the future, so tell me what the future is. And the witches tell him a couple of different things, one of which is, you're going to be totally fine until trees march upon your castle. Until the trees come and get you, you're all good. And Macbeth is like, well, the trees can't move, so I must be all good forever. Nothing bad is going to happen. What actually happens is Macduff has the clever idea to have all of the army break off tree branches and hold them in front of them so they can like creep up on the castle like it's a panto, like Dora the Explorer or something, and you're just, you know, sneaking up on a character on stage to disguise their numbers as well, so that Macbeth and Macbeth's army can't tell how many people are coming to get him. And the other prophecy is Macbeth cannot be killed by someone who is born from a woman. And Macbeth thinks, well, great, everyone is born from a woman, therefore I cannot be killed. This is fantastic. And when he meets with Macduff, Macbeth says, haha, joke's on you, I can't be killed. If you're born from a woman, I'm immortal, like, joke's on you. And then Macduff says, aha, I was born as a cesarean. Like, I was cut out of my mother's stomach. I wasn't like a natural birth. We would argue from our contemporary mindset, he still had a mum, he was still born from a woman, but the loophole in the prophecy is Macduff wasn't, you know, naturally born from a woman, hence Macduff can kill Macbeth. So all of the prophecies in this play come true. Except, like, technically Banquo's sons don't yet get to be king, but it's implied that they will one day because Fleance can escape. So the prophecies come true. Does that mean this is a play about prophecies being true and witches being real? Not necessarily, but we will discuss that. And we can get into the background info. So this is a historically complicated play, but I'll try and untangle the important things to know. Like I said, this is a story based on some real historical figures. You don't have to know a ton about the real history because Shakespeare told his own story, but there are some noteworthy things that might help you in constructing your interpretations and then ultimately writing your essays. For starters, this play was written in the Jacobean era, meaning when King James, I don't know why it's Jacobean and not Jamesian, but when King James was the King of England. The previous era was the Elizabethan era, when Queen Elizabeth I was queen. And King James came to the throne like less than 3 years before this play came out. So the previous monarch, Queen Elizabeth, was queen for, I want to say like over 6 years. She was a long reigning monarch who was much loved, who brought a period of great stability and like the arts flourished, society for the most part flourished, much loved monarch. And so she died without an heir. James wasn't her son. James, like, they kind of had to go back in the family tree and then find King James to take over when she died. So King James comes to the throne. England is still a little bit apprehensive about what this Scottish king James was previously the king of Scotland, and then he became the king of England as well. England was apprehensive about what this weirdo was going to bring across the border from Scotland. So, also known as King James VI of Scotland, inherited the throne, that should be 6, sorry, not 4th. He inherited the throne from Elizabeth I, so yeah, much loved queen, but she died without an heir. Big fan of massive pants, whatever you want to say about him, he had great costumes, but he was incredibly superstitious. He was paranoid about the idea of the supernatural. He actually wrote this book called Demonology in the Form of a Dialogue, written by the mighty Prince James, by the grace of God, the King of England. He literally wrote a book that was like the anti-witch propaganda book about how terrifying and terrible witches were. Super superstitious, and he also believed that both people and supernatural forces were plotting against him. I can't attest to the witches, but people plotting against him was a legit fear. For anyone who knows about the gunpowder plot, if you've studied this period of history at school or if you want to Google it, yeah, there were legit forces within his kingdom trying to depose him because they didn't think that he deserved to or should be king. Ultimately, though, he was, yeah, super highly educated, smart dude. As you can see, no one wears pants like this unless they've got like a big brain. And he oversaw a golden age of literature. Now, he is also, and the reason why I brought up that point earlier about like Shakespeare wanted to get in the king's good books is that at this time in England, the monarch, whether they were a king or queen, were the ones who made decisions about art funding, basically, who gets the money to put on productions and to write plays and to produce literature. So Shakespeare wants to produce the kind of play that portrays King James, not directly, he's not going to write a play about the current monarch, that's too risky, but he's going to, in the themes and messages of his work, endorse the current monarch and kind of go along with the general attitudes or things that he's trying to, things that the king is trying to make happen. In this case, once James comes to the throne, Shakespeare gets it in his head that like, hey, we have this king who really hates witches. Maybe it would be a good idea for me to write a play about witches and how evil they are and how they can make evil things happen. Hence Macbeth. So what was Shakespeare up to? Shakespeare wrote for an audience, and I mean this both literally and politically. Politically is what I was just talking about, which is Shakespeare writes knowing who is going to see his plays, which important people are going to rock up and sit in the special reserved box. What's that box called at the football for like, whatever, the VIP room. Shakespeare knows who's going to be there. And if it's King James, he knows what King James wants to see and what ideas he wants to have endorsed in the literature that's being produced at the time. So Shakespeare writes with this in mind. That's where a lot of the messages and a lot of the themes come from. That's why we analyze Shakespeare and other great works. But he also wrote for an audience literally. Shakespeare did not sit down and write Macbeth so that we could then read the script of the play. He's writing a play with the idea that it should be performed, and which some people would argue is why, if you're just sitting there and reading it, you're not getting a real feel for the characters, let alone the language, and like, you know, time has taken its toll on our ability to understand Shakespeare. But yeah, if you see it performed, that's where some of the things like Macbeth's descent into madness become much more apparent. Even though the words, yes, are there on the page, and that's how we analyze books in English, there's something missing from the, like when you actually see it performed, produced, adapted, you can get a real feel for the meaning when the intended mode of production is, you know, shown to you. The other thing Shakespeare's reinforcing, alongside, you know, witches are bad and scary, look out for them, is the divine right of kings, which was a medieval idea that still somewhat persists to this day, that the king was appointed by God, meaning the king or queen is God's representative on earth. And so the divine right of kings is that God bestows the power on the king, and the king's lineage then, basically the crown is passed from the king to their son, to their son, to their son, or occasionally their daughter. So the divine right of kings stipulates that this is how God wants things to happen. If you go against the divine right of kings, you are effectively going against God, which for a highly religious society at the time was very controversial. So Macbeth's actions in killing King Duncan and breaking that divine right of kings and taking the throne for himself, again, further crimes of Macbeth, and it further demonizes him in the minds of the audience, because they see, oh my God, he's committed, like, it's like when a character in a TV show like kicks a puppy in the face, you're like, you're a bad person and I want bad things to happen to you. That's what King James is sitting there thinking, like, a character in this play has just killed a king. I'm a king. That character better get his just desserts or I'm going to be unhappy. So part of the descent of Macbeth and the unraveling of Macbeth's mind is showing the literal, like the death and the psychological torment that will happen if you break the divine right of kings. The other thing I'm going to talk about with Shakespeare is that, again, there's a reason why you study him so much in English. All of his texts have 4 main layers. This is true of all English texts, but especially Shakespeare. So I like to break this down in a little pyramid. On the bottom, we have all of the structural features. So these are the quotes, the symbols, metaphors, motifs, stage directions, all the actual language that makes up the play. That's the basis of everything that comes from it. Our idea of who the characters are, that all comes from the structural features. So the language that Shakespeare uses creates these characters, these personalities, Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, that are so famous you can see them through all sorts of other fiction and all sorts of modern adaptations. And from the characters, we get a sense of what the themes are and what the key ideas are in the play. And right at the top of the pyramid, we have what I call views and values, which are what is Shakespeare trying to tell us. So the themes would be something like kingship, what it means to be king. And the views and values are, you should not go against the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings is a sacred and highly important, pillar of society. So views and values is Shakespeare telling us this is what I think and believe. Themes are the key ideas, characters, key people, structural features, key language stuff. And what I'm going to argue for this interpretation section is that all of this contributes to the notion that the tragedy of Macbeth is inevitable. Shakespeare's ultimate message, and the thing that pretty much any other theme or character can be tied back to, is the idea of inevitability, because it links to the concept, to the themes of ambition, prophecy, destiny, all that. So, who is to blame for the inevitability of the tragedy of Macbeth? Why do bad things happen in this play? For anyone who's just joined us, we'll talk about a couple of questions at the end. I've got a specified time for that, so I can get into them in enough detail. Please continue to drop questions throughout. If there's anything that's relevant to what I'm saying now, I'll answer them as part of the lecture. Any general English questions, I'll leave for the end, and then I can talk about them in more detail. Hope that's all good. All right, who's to blame for Macbeth? I like to think of this as a seed that's just becoming a flower, right? On the ground level, we have the fertile soil of Macbeth's ambition. None of this would happen if there wasn't really good soil there for these ideas to take root. And then we have the witch's prophecy, which is like sunshine bringing the seed to the surface. And if this never happened, if there was no sunshine, we wouldn't get a plant. This is essential for the whole process to happen. And once the witch's prophecy happens, Lady Macbeth rocks up, and I'll talk about this quote in a second. Lady Macbeth is like the water to the plant that helps it grow. All of these three elements are essential for the tragedy to unfold. If Macbeth wasn't ambitious, none of this would happen, because he wouldn't have heard the prophecy and then be like, I could be king. And if there was no prophecy, the idea wouldn't have been put in his head, and he would have just, stayed in the dirt. And if it wasn't for Lady Macbeth's manipulation, Macbeth likely wouldn't have gone through with killing Duncan and making that first and irreversible step off a cliff and towards his doom. Interestingly, Banquo is almost aware of this, and Banquo has this quote: if you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me. This is when Banquo and Macbeth first meet the witches. And this is Banquo basically saying, if you guys are so capable of reading the future, tell me exactly what's going to happen. And the witches then sort of obfuscate and don't quite answer him. So like I said, Banquo is the more cautious one of the two. But all of this creates this ultimate sense of inevitability because of these circumstances. Because Macbeth happened to be ambitious, because the witches happened to give him this particular prophecy and phrased it in a particular way, and because Lady Macbeth had this particular power to know exactly how to manipulate and water her husband's ambitious desires, we get the inevitable tragedy that has, I think, like 7 people dying, give or take, and a whole army, like a whole battle taking place at the end. So the reason why I like this interpretation is because, like I said, it links to all these other key themes, and it helps you understand Shakespeare's ultimate message, which is that because of these circumstances, the tragedy is inevitable. Okay, let's get into characters. This is where things get a little bit more more analytical. I'm also hoping that, like I said, as much as I'll try and answer live questions and stuff in the moment, you can come back and watch this video all throughout the year. So hello, your future self. And yeah, revise this. And so if in future you get assigned a character-based essay on Macbeth, hopefully these slides in this video will be useful to you. So let's talk about our protagonist. Macbeth is a tragic hero. The definition of a tragic hero is a noble or sympathetic character whose major flaw, or hamasha, I'll define that later, leads to a tragic outcome. So not your standard hero whom you sympathize with the whole way through and they do nothing but good things. Aristotle has this nice quote about tragic heroes. A man cannot become a hero until he sees the root of his own downfall. And that describes Macbeth really nicely. Hamartia is a fatal flaw, a major flaw that leads to one's downfall, usually one's death. Very common in Shakespeare. You see it in all sorts of protagonists. So Othello, if you've studied that play, Othello's Hamartia is his, his insecurity, his prejudices. You could argue Hamlet's Hamartia is his procrastination, his tendency to want to delay things. A lot of Shakespearean heroes have good fatal flaws. Macbeth is also kind of falls victim to his hubris, which is excessive arrogance or self-confidence, the belief that you can do anything. Hubris is a very common hamartia that leads to people's undoing. Another word that comes from all of these are Greek theatre terms, basically, from the era of Aristotle, is anagnorisis. You don't have to know how to pronounce it, you just have to be able to use it in your essays, which is a profound and crucial realization. I will talk about this when we talk about Macbeth's Act 5, scene 2 or scene 6 soliloquy. It's the famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech that ends with tale told by an idiot signifying tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. It's Macbeth's realization that there is no point to his life and arguably life in general anymore. So his his lowest point is this moment of anagnorisis where he realizes what he's done and the horror that he's unleashed. So when thinking about Macbeth's character, think about the choices that he makes, think about the goals that he has and what he wants, think about what he values, what he prioritizes, and a term that I like from physics is think about his trajectory, like the trajectory of a paper plane if you were throwing it. Think about the journey if you were to graph it and what kind of direction he goes down. Does he, if I were to point out a version of this, he starts the play as the Thane of Glamis, everything's all right, and then he becomes the Thane of Cawdor, and he's like, oh, okay, this is good. And then the witches tell him, hey, you're going to be king one day, all the way up here. But in order to get there, he has to commit murder and also kind of sacrifice a part of himself, a part of his humanity. And from then on, it's nothing but downhill. And then he kills Banquo, and it's even more steep downhill. That can be a useful way of visualizing the events of the play as well, thinking about his mental journey and how he progresses. So, speaking of progression, let's think about how his morals change over the course of the play. At the start, and these are some great quotes to memorize for your essays, he is described as brave Macbeth, a worthy gentleman. He is likened to an eagle and a lion, animalistic imagery that's very noble. But he's also a man who was described as bathing in reeking wounds, which at the time, I guess, was a good thing because it meant he was a brave soldier, even though nowadays it's kind of all right, maybe put a bandage on first. It's also worth noting that Macbeth thinks about murdering Duncan before Lady Macbeth comes and persuades him to do so. So after he hears the prophecy, he says, if good, why do I yield to that suggestion? It's almost like the witches rock up and say, hey, you'll be king one day, goodbye. And Macbeth's like, that's interesting. Those witches just suggested that I should kill Duncan. The witches didn't technically do that, but that's already the idea that is formulating in his mind. But at this point, he's saying, the idea of killing Duncan is so horrid that the image doth unfix my hair. Thinking about committing something so violent makes my hair, stand on end and makes me go crazy and makes my seated heart knock at my ribs. My heart was previously seated and calm, but now my heart's racing because I'm like, I can't kill Duncan, that would be crazy. But he's already thinking it. So that does imply that Macbeth intrinsically in himself had something that made him capable of doing this. He just needed the right person, the right wife to push him down the path. Occasionally throughout the play, he is particularly vicious and violent, and this gets increasingly more prominent and obvious and undeniable as the play progresses. Upon seeing the murderers covered in Banquo's blood, he says, "'Tis better thee without than he within." So the three murderers who kill Banquo come back and say, we've killed Banquo, Fleance escaped, but we killed Banquo. Macbeth sees them covered in the blood of his friend, and he says, oh, I'm glad that you guys are covered in his blood, rather than that blood being inside of him, because he's a threat to me. I'm so glad his blood is all over you. which is quite a horrifying thing to announce. And then gradually his personality becomes fractured and fragmented, and you can see that deterioration in multiple scenes as guilt takes its toll on his mind. He says to himself as he's like pacing around the castle late at night, and he's talking about himself in the third person as well. Glamis, remember he was previously Thane of Glamis at the start of the play. The Thane of Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. The Thane of Glamis did something that murdered sleep and made it impossible for him to sleep anymore because he committed this horrible, horrible crime. And therefore the Thane of Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more. His personality is fractured between the Thane of Glamis, who like received the prophecy and committed to killing Duncan, the Thane of Cawdor, which is his correct title. Like he went from Glamis to Cawdor, and that was all legit. And Cawdor is the one who's suffering, like that's his, his soul. He doesn't refer to himself as king here, even though he says this quote in Act 3, 4, where he is already king. But he thinks of himself as the Thane of Cawdor because he's not the true legitimate king. He stole the crown, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. That other part of my personality committed a crime, and now Cawdor, my other personality, is suffering from it. So he really starts to deteriorate, and he is expressing this with high modal language, a technique that means the words are very certain and this shall happen, it will, it must, as opposed to it might or it could, which would be low modal. High modal language, Macbeth shall sleep no more. Macbeth is never going to sleep again because of what he's done. But Macbeth's saying this, so his character is, all over the place. And then right at the end, just before or kind of during Lady Macbeth's death, so she's off stage and he hears her, or he hears a woman scream. I think it's a different woman, but yeah, he says, I have almost forgotten the taste of fears. I have supped full with horrors. Like I have experienced so much death and blood and travesty that I've forgotten what it's like to be afraid. This woman in the distance who's screaming like, oh, that's what that is. I've forgotten that. I don't care. I stab people for the fun of it. Familiar to my slaughterous thoughts, cannot once stir me. The concept of fearing for life or fearing pain or fearing bad things happening doesn't even register with me anymore because I'm so far gone. By the end, he seeks his own death. And he's thinking about that prophecy that like Macbeth can't be killed by someone born from a woman. He's like, damn it, I want to die. Like, I'm sick of this. Look at all the hell I've caused. Everyone's unhappy or dead or in pain. He basically is running around the castle being like, hey, were you born of a woman? No, all right, were you born of a woman? You were, oh, damn it, because he's like looking for someone to put an end to all of this. He fights till my bones from my flesh be hacked. Basically this is I wish the state of the world were now undone. This is his, I'm absolutely over it, logic. Sorry, I think there was another quote to support that one as well, but he is just, absolutely exhausted. And even though he commits himself to fight until the end, he does so with this real hollowness inside. Meanwhile, his wife, Lady Macbeth, is, like I said, profoundly, super interesting, complex. There is a lot you can say about her. While studying this play, I would highly recommend doing at least 1 or 2 practice essays, specifically just on Lady Macbeth, because she's that interesting, she's that complicated. And there's a lot you can say about her, her psychological descent into madness, her attitude and how unique she is as a female character that has so much power and agency, and her relationship with her husband and kind of, even though this isn't 100%, like you can debate this, Macbeth isn't just an innocent, cute little corgi. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can say about her, how she manipulates him. So let's talk about this complexity that I keep mentioning. Lady Macbeth loves her husband. So one particular interpretation that you could take is that she is doing this out of a devotion to him and a desire to bring him to power and have him be the best he can be. Wow, how nice of her. So you could consider whether or not Macbeth loves her back, and Macbeth also has the same affinity for his wife. He is quite emotionally distant from her in some ways, but also dependent on her. And we see her, I can't remember if I've got this in a later slide, but the first scene where we see Lady Macbeth, she's at home at the castle while Macbeth's still fighting and meeting witches. She's at the castle and she opens a letter about like political kind of machinations and what's going on. that in itself is very unique and strange for a woman of the time, a woman who is like meant to be the homekeeper at the castle raising children. We'll get to that. Lady Macbeth has no children, but she's like opening letters about military strategy and responding to them and commanding people. So she has these, I'm going to talk about like her masculine characteristics. Anytime I'm doing that, I'm talking about stereotypically masculine things like acting authoritatively and commanding other people. Obviously these aren't manly traits by any means, but we're talking about stereotypical characteristics here. Yeah, she is often referred to as a somewhat masculine female character because of how much political influence she wields and how she can manipulate people. Well, I'll leave most of that for the themes discussion because I'll talk about what that means for her later. Big question for her character. What does Lady Macbeth want out of all of this? At the start of the play, she is in a state of a kind of desperation for something more, and as soon as she hears about Macbeth's prophecy, as he writes to her in a letter before he comes home, she's instantly committed to the idea, and her first instinct is to say, I don't think my husband is capable of doing what needs to be done. Like, she says, I fear thy nature, talking about her husband, I fear Macbeth's nature is too full of the milk of human kindness. And so she expresses, again, we'll talk about this when we talk about language, she refers to her husband as a, too feminine or too milky and too sweet and innocuous and not manly enough to do what she thinks is necessary for him to become king. And so in her mind, perhaps out of a devotion to her husband, or if you wanted to argue the opposite, perhaps out of a selfish desire for power herself, she, quote unquote, wears the pants in the relationship. She acknowledges that she has to be the driving force and the masculine energy that propels them to their success. So Macbeth, before killing Banquo, tells Lady Macbeth, be innocent of the knowledge until the deed is done. After the murder of Duncan, for reasons that we will explore, Macbeth keeps things from her, and the two of them kind of go their separate ways almost, where he's not really emotionally supporting her remotely, but she's also not super keen on the idea anymore because she starts to really unravel. Whereas post Duncan, Macbeth becomes king and he's still sort of committed to the idea. Killing Banquo is Macbeth's big turning point, but the death of Duncan is Lady Macbeth's. And she has obviously a more prominent role in this first murder. So why is she punished for her crimes? When discussing the murder of Duncan, basically Lady Macbeth is initially going to kill Duncan herself, and she rocks up with the knife and gets as far as like getting into his room while he's sleeping with the knife ready to stab him. And her rationale for why she can't is that Duncan's face reminded her of her own father, and suddenly she thought about the prospect of actually killing someone who was known to her. You'd think she would have thought that through beforehand, but whatever. And she can't go through with it. So she runs back to Macbeth and is like, here's the knife, you do it, I can't. But aside from that, she is an incredibly, driven, motivated character in those ways. Is Shakespeare suggesting that those characteristics are, unwomanly and unbecoming and shouldn't be anything that society celebrates? Something that, so when she's talking about Macbeth, you're too full of the milk of human kindness, you're too weak, you're too whatever, you're not going to be able to do this. She calls on spirits and she says, take my milk for gall. Gall meaning poison, by the way, like black tar and gross stuff. When she says, take my milk for gall, she is literally saying, exchange my breast milk and my, what makes me a woman for poison, for something dark and evil that's going to help me do what needs to be done in my evil deeds. And so what she's, metaphorically saying is, take everything about me that is womanly and replace it with poison and evil so that I can do the same kind of powerful evil things that men are capable of. But another fact about her character that's revealed over the course of the play is that she has experienced the loss of a child. She previously had a kid and now doesn't. We don't know what happened. That's all left ambiguous. But it means that this line where she's like, take my breast milk, has that extra tinge of tragedy to it where she's saying, I have no need for things that make me a woman. I don't have kids. Potentially I can't have kids. We don't know. But she is in a position where she can't fulfill the stereotypical duties of a woman. Hence, maybe tragically, she is attempting to fulfill the duties required of a man because she knows her husband can't do so. And so they're both in this position where they can't measure up to their stereotypical expectations that society has for them. And so she says, take my milk for gall. Why not? Like, I might as well be evil and do what I can. So maybe this is maybe she is in her own way a tragic figure rather than a totally evil B-word who's just trying to kill everyone so that she can be the most powerful woman. Another thing about Macbeth, he kills lots of children in this play. I think this has the highest child death rate out of all of Shakespeare's work. Macduff's son, so the murder of Lady Macduff and his son, the innocent family that Macbeth slaughters at the end. There's also a character called Siward who has a child called young Siward, very original, who dies in the battle. And he also attempts to kill Fleance. So there is this repeated emphasis on the deaths of children and what that means for Macbeth's character. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth overestimates her own ruthlessness. Here we go. When she goes to kill Duncan, he reminds her of her father, even though beforehand she compels, and when she's calling on the spirits and saying, take my milk for gall, this is her unsex me here soliloquy, where she is saying, take away my gender, my sex. And she says, let no compunctious visitings of nature, let no visions or prophecies or any, flights of fancy, no thoughts, no beliefs, no nothing, shake my fell purpose. Don't let anything stop me. Please, spirits, let me be the kind of powerful person who doesn't think twice. And yet she does. She can't fight that nature. Despite her calling on spirits, she's ultimately unsuccessful in becoming the, evil girl boss that she wants to be. And I think she's also quite naive to the consequences of her actions and of Macbeth's actions. So after the murder, a little water clears us of this deed. How easy it is. Which is dramatically ironic because at the end of the play, we see her trying to wash the blood from her hands, hallucinated blood from her hands, and this is where the out, damn spot quote comes from. She's unable to get clean. And has a good line about Macbeth has a good line about, my hands are so red and covered with blood that if I put them in the ocean, the whole sea would turn red. That's how deep and profound my guilt is. She's also quite cunning, quite perceptive. She's a somewhat Machiavellian character, which is a word that comes from a political manifesto book written by a guy called Niccolo Machiavelli in the 1500s, I think, who he basically set out to write this book that was how to be manipulative and persuasive. So if we call a character Machiavellian, we're calling them basically manipulative and capable of deceiving people and manipulating their own image, so how people view them. And she commands her husband to look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. On the surface, you should be sweet and delightful and no one should suspect you, but in reality, you're a snake hiding behind that flower, ready to bite anyone who tries to come at you. Do I have another? No, okay, we'll leave Lady Macbeth there. Lots more you can untangle about her, but hopefully this has given you some ideas for what you can think about and talk about throughout the year, throughout your essays. I want to go through the boys, the other male characters in the play, and then we'll do something similar for the female characters. Banquo, I've talked about, is Macbeth's best friend, remember? And his son is Fleance. King Duncan, doesn't last too long. And then Macduff and Malcolm are the ones who join forces. So Macduff is like Macbeth's rival. You can remember that by remembering that their names start with Mac, which is very frustrating. But yeah, Macduff is a Thane, just like Macbeth, but he's like Macbeth's good twin, who does the right things and fights for the right causes by the end. And Macduff is the one who kills Macbeth. Malcolm is Duncan's son, so he would have been next in line for the throne before Macbeth stole the kingdom. And by the end of the play, Malcolm is crowned king, and so order is restored, things are all back to normal, Malcolm's a good guy. So, let's talk about Banquo. I'll leave these notes, I'll go through them semi-quickly, but you can come back to these throughout the year. This is the kind of slide that might be more useful to you in a few weeks or months' time. I've kind of said this already, he is more pragmatic, more cautious, credulous than Macbeth. He even literally tries to warn Macbeth, hey, sometimes to make us do bad things, the instruments of darkness, like witches, tell us truths and win us with honest trifles. They'll tell you something that's half true, but then they will betray you in deepest consequence. They'll give you a prophecy that technically is right, but there are loopholes and hidden meanings that will be your undoing and lead to tragedy, which is exactly what happens. So Banquo, very wise, we're very much on his side. Similarly, Macbeth killing Banquo is what triggers his madness, and he loses any semblance of that cautiousness. Like cautious pragmatism, level-headedness, that dies with Banquo. And Macbeth's kind of left astray and picking up the pieces. In some ways, Banquo is like a foil to Macbeth. If you haven't heard this word before, it's a great one to use in English and literature for describing two characters who, when put next to each other, two characters or ideas, anything, two characters that when put next to each other create a very obvious contrast. And you can conclude things about those characters that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to if you were only looking at one of them. So a foil is like an important counterpart or a compare and contrast opportunity. So in some ways, Banquo encourages us or acts as a foil because we can contrast how cautious and how wise he was with how sort of hot-headed, impetuous, how hubristic, how proud and arrogant Macbeth was in thinking, oh, I'm totally going to be king. Let me kill Duncan to make this happen. After Banquo dies, we arguably, asterisk, don't see him ever again in the play, but we do see his ghost, and some productions vary in how this appears. We know for a fact that, in this scene, Banquo's ghost is sitting at a feast, and Macbeth walks into the room, and Lady Macbeth's like, hey, come in, everything's fine, come sit down, even though you're still like a bit psychologically weird. Lady Macbeth's like, hey, can you pull it together, please? Like, we have guests, we have to appear normal, you're the king now. And Lady Macbeth's like, come sit down, and Macbeth said, there's no seat free for me, what do you mean? And Lady Macbeth's like, this seat right here. And in that seat, Macbeth's seat, is Banquo's ghost, who is staring at him the whole time. In some productions, when you watch this in the theatre or in some movies as well, Banquo's ghost will be a physical character. And so they have an actor there with, Banquo's actor with white makeup or whatever, or bloody makeup, and they make him look like a really scary ghost. In other productions, no one's there. And so it's like basically, if you see the ghost, it's like we're seeing things from Macbeth's perspective. Because he's like, why is Banquo's ghost here? Why is this, why are you tormenting me like this? Meanwhile, all the other characters, including Lady Macbeth, are like, can you calm down, please? What do you mean? It's an empty chair. Why are you reacting like this? So if we see the ghost, we understand why Macbeth is so horrified. But if we don't see the ghost, then it's almost like we're sitting at that dinner table too, and we just notice a madman come in being like, there's someone sitting in that chair, and there obviously isn't to us. So that can emphasize different themes within the play, but either way, really powerful turning point moment that unravels Macbeth. Supposedly, like I said, in real life, King James claimed that he was an ancestor. That's the part that's a little bit dubious, but whatever. He's king, he can say whatever he wants. James claimed that he was a descendant of Fleance. He is not a perfect character. So even though I've said he's really smart, switched on, he kind of predicts what's going to happen and the tragedy that's going to unfold, he doesn't share these suspicions with people like Macduff and Malcolm, who are in a position to try and fix things and sort things out. And so when he dies, there's a sense of like, you should have been able to do something about this. So it's not to say that he is an absolutely perfect, flawless character, but ultimately his death is certainly a tragedy, and we're definitely meant to sympathize with him. Meanwhile, King Duncan, is the epitome, the perfect example of a good ruler and a king, even though he's also not entirely without fault. Like, basically his only flaw is that he's too trusting, he's too good. So, both of the people that he appoints to be Thane of Cawdor end up betraying him. At the start of the play, the reason why Macbeth is made Thane of Cawdor is because the previous Thane of Cawdor was rebelling against King Duncan and was killed. So Macbeth then is given that title, and then, as Thane of Cawdor, he kills Duncan again. So that kind of hints at this repeated problem for Duncan, where he's trusting the wrong people and giving the wrong people power when they end up, turning against him. Nevertheless, he represents stability and social order. So he is a good king, like I said, very likable. However, he's not very fearsome, which was an important trait in Shakespeare's time. Like, in order to command authority and be a good king, you had to appear like a powerful man, unfortunately, or woman at the time. You had to be basically you had to command more authority. People couldn't just like you, they had to respect you and fear you on some level. When I'll talk about the scene when we talk about these two characters, but after Duncan dies, Macduff tells Malcolm, Duncan's son, that basically when they're talking about whether or not people are fit to govern, Macduff calls Duncan a most sainted king. And similarly, this ties in with the notion of the divine right of kings, as Duncan was rightly, justly ordained, like, you know, put in that position by God. And so the characters that acknowledge this are the ones who realize how bad things are and how bad things become after Macbeth's murder. So, a couple more quick things. When Duncan dies, there are lots of ominous foreshadowing weather events which hint at the idea that his death is very unnatural and the whole world is rebelling against it. On the night that Duncan dies and afterwards, there's all these storms and weird things happening, animals eating each other, like horrific stuff going on, because it's as though the whole world is rebelling against, the idea. Another key difference between Duncan and Macbeth is that Duncan has two sons, Malcolm, who's first in line, and another character called Donalbain, who's not super important. But the point is, having kids as a monarch means it's kind of like a insurance policy for the future, so that society, the body politic, people in England or Scotland know what's going to happen next. If and when Duncan dies, whatever happens, Malcolm's going to be king next. There's also the backup plan of Donalbain, who's also there. It basically gives people more confidence in their monarch because, Duncan's a good king, he's raising good kids, everything's going to be fine. If monarchs don't have someone next in line, society might be a little bit on edge, or like, hey, you're getting old, like, what's going to happen when you're not longer here? Who's going to take care of us, right? And Macbeth has no plan of succession. He has no next in line because he doesn't have any children, which is a testimony to how stable Duncan's reign is and how unstable Macbeth's is. I'm getting all the names mixed up now. Finally, after Macbeth kills Duncan, he says, "Who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him?" On a literal level, Macbeth's just like, oh my god, a human body has a lot of blood. Like, this is a problem. I thought I'd just be able to stab and it'd be fine, but there's like blood everywhere, all over me. But figuratively, who would have thought this old man, just, King Duncan, likable dude, whatever, he has so much blood, he's so full of life. He had such life force, even though he was just this old dude that shouldn't have mattered. He should have lived because he had so much blood and he deserved life. And so Macbeth's crying, etc., etc. Macduff, meanwhile, he's probably the more obvious foil to Macbeth. Even though Banquo's kind of there, Macduff is the one who, triumphs over him. And he's imperfect in his own ways, much like Duncan, quite trusting, arguably. But he's also very chivalrous. He's very respectful in the way that he treats women. When he finds Duncan's dead body, and Lady Macbeth's like, hey, what's going on? Why is everyone screaming? He says, "'Tis not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell." Basically, if I told you what happened, you'd die, because it's so horrifying and I don't want to subject you to that. Even though you could argue by modern standards it's a little bit weird and condescending, he is doing so with a view to protect her and keep her safe from, the horrors that he's witnessed. He's also super cut up about Duncan's death. He's really upset. Unlike the Macbeth and his wife, who rock up and they're like, oh no, oh Duncan, no, come back, we really miss you. Macduff is like, my king, my liege, like I'd sworn fealty to you, I miss you already. Lady Macbeth is like, oh, I'm gonna faint, right? They put on more of a, I'm exaggerating, but in the play, they are obviously faking it, and we're meant to know that. And Macduff starts to see through things because he's like, I'm really upset and you guys aren't. That's strange to me. Ultimately, his predominant characteristic is that he puts his country above himself and Also, ultimately his family, because Macduff's wife and child are murdered because he goes off to fight and takes arms against Macbeth. Therefore, he leaves his own house undefended, basically, and murderers can get in and kill his family. Because he's so preoccupied with the idea that we have to get the throne back and put Malcolm back on the throne and avenge Duncan's death. So Macduff is more of the typical hero character, even though we're following Macbeth because this is a tragedy. So, yeah, only other complicated point about his character is that Macduff isn't fighting to be king. He's not trying to take the throne for himself, and that kind of makes him even better as a character. He's not like Macbeth in that he wants the kingdom for himself. He just wants the right person to be king. And he has this particularly powerful scene with Malcolm where Macduff basically tests Malcolm to make sure he's the right man for the job and that he doesn't have to go to, good old Donalbain instead. Macduff cares deeply about the fate of Scotland, and everything he does is about ensuring Scotland is good and safe and in the right hands. So part of that is his relationship with Malcolm, who is depicted as being quite young. Potentially that's also why Macduff is the one who commits the crime of killing a king, King Macbeth, and beheads him and commits this pretty violent action. Because it would have been a bit weird if Malcolm rocks up and beheads someone and also kills a king, because killing a king is a very bad thing in Shakespearean times, and killing Duncan was it was basically Macbeth's kind of worst crime in the lens of, from the perspective of, King James and the audience who are watching. This is like a really atrocious moral sin, right? That sets him down the path and turns him into a murderer. So if Malcolm was to kill a king, even if it's justified, it still feels a bit like, okay, now we've got this, 14-year-old coming to the throne and he's already killed someone, what's going to happen next? So Malcolm basically has a clean slate because Macduff is the one who commits the murder and then is like, and here's the crown to you, Malcolm, you're going to be a good and peaceful king. But yeah, at the start of the play, he's depicted as like not remotely ready for kingship, but with the help of Macduff, he basically becomes a little bit more savvy about what's going on. And yeah, you kind of start to see his intelligence shine through. Act 4, Scene 3 is his most important scene. This is where he and Macduff have this rather complicated discussion where, so basically, Macbeth is currently king. To say anything bad about Macbeth would be treason, would be going against a king, so we can't do that. But Macduff knows that Macbeth was the one who killed Duncan. Macduff knows that Macbeth shouldn't be king. He's bad, he's evil, terrible things are going to happen. He's killed, Banquo and who knows who else. So Macduff doesn't want Macbeth to be king, and Macduff wants to support Malcolm, who's Duncan's son and the rightful king. Malcolm has fled because he also suspects that Macbeth has killed his father, but he doesn't want to say so because now Macbeth's king and he's in danger. And Malcolm knows that he would be, basically he knows that he was meant to be king because his father was king, but Malcolm's also afraid to say anything. So Macduff and Malcolm meet up and they're like, so what do you think about Macbeth? Malcolm's like, so what do you think about Macbeth? None of them want to be the first to say, we should rebel against Macbeth and we should kill the king, because that's quite a big deal, but both of them are thinking it. So they start to play this mind game where Macduff is like, basically, oh, your father was all right, but, I guess it's a good thing that Macbeth is king now because, he wasn't even fit to govern. Your father wasn't a good person. And Malcolm is like, how dare you? My father was a good man. And Malcolm sticks up for him. And so Macduff's like, all right, tick. I reckon you're decent. But then Malcolm plays the same game where he's like, I want to make sure that Macduff is supporting me for the right reasons and wants me to be king for the right reasons. So Malcolm says, hey, Macduff, I kind of agree, Macbeth isn't a good dude, but I'm worried that I wouldn't be a good king, me, Malcolm, because, I'm really lazy. For example, he's just making up things about himself to see what Macduff says. And Macduff's like, okay, that's not ideal, but, with the right people around you, we can make sure that, we'll get you out of bed on time and make sure you're not super lazy and negligent. And then Malcolm's like, oh, but I'm also a drunk and I sleep around a lot and I don't really care about the kingdom. I wouldn't be a good person. Because the test in Malcolm's mind is, does Macduff want just me to be king because he's loyal to Duncan, or does he want the right person to be king? And so when Malcolm says, I don't care, and he depicts himself in a really negative light, Macduff says, you know what, screw you, Malcolm, you don't deserve to be king. I was loyal to Duncan because he deserved it. You are not fit to govern, you know? If that's the truth about you, you don't deserve this. And then Malcolm's like, I'm just kidding, I'm not actually like that, but I'm glad that you, Macduff, are going to support the right person. Let's join forces. So the outcome of this scene is that they both realize, all right, we're on the same side and we are both smart and we are the right people to be, you know, making things right for the whole kingdom. So like I said, really interesting characters. Don't let your analysis stop with just Macbeth. There's a lot you can say about all of these guys as supporting evidence in your body paragraphs as well. I'll leave this here for you to look at later, but basically, if you ever in your body paragraphs want to be able to compare characters and jump between them, there's a bunch you can zoom into in here and say like, okay, both Banquo and Macduff are very wise and cautious characters. Both of them have a son, so they have that link to family in common. Both Malcolm, basically these hopefully are just ideas for your future essays and things. And there are also some keywords here for particular characters. So like both Malcolm and Banquo are ones who don't commit any murders. So by the end of the play, they are still, even though Banquo is dead, they're still pure characters in our minds. Whereas both Macbeth and Macduff commit the sin of killing a king, regicide, killing a king. It's just that they do so for very different reasons. So for your essays, please make sure you are thinking about comparing and contrasting. You never want to just have a single character in a body paragraph where you're only talking about Banquo for a whole paragraph, because that doesn't leave you a lot of room for zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, because by the end of that paragraph, you're just going to be like, therefore, this is what we can say about Banquo. And it's not as impressive than if you could say like, here are some things about Banquo and about Malcolm, therefore, this is what Shakespeare is saying about being morally pure, because you've been able to look at them both. So yeah, always try and compare and contrast. Now, to come back to the female characters, there aren't many more of them, but there are the witches and there is Hecate, who's like the head of the witches that we'll talk about. So 3 witches represent dark powers capable of influencing men's decisions. Sorry, quick water break. You could also interpret them as an outward representation of Macbeth's inner evil. Basically, symbolically in the play, the witches are like a force that matches how sinister Macbeth is and how his evil ambitions prey on other people. Alternatively, you could say that the witches are kind of like how women have to exert power because there's no possible way for them to do so legitimately in society. They have to be these sinister forces that like puppet masters pulling the strings, as opposed to like men fighting in battles in order to attain power. There are a bunch of different quotes about just how unnatural they are, like rats without a tail. And also worth questioning, are the witches necessarily evil? Do they necessarily have power in the text? I've already said that like all of their prophecies come true and they set events in motion, but does that make them powerful? Or are they magical puppet masters? Or are they just like these little weird rats that kind of nibble around the edges of things and try and push people down a certain pathway, even though ultimately it's the characters themselves that are making particular choices. The very first scene of the play gives us this line: fair is foul and foul is fair. This is a subversion. Fair is foul, what's good is bad and what's bad is good. And it sets the stage for the whole play, in which everything gets topsy-turvy because, you know, doing the right thing is complicated and evil can sometimes be justifiable and good people are going to turn bad and vice versa. So the whole play is creating this essence of, and the fact that the witches are in scene 1, and that's how the play begins. We get a sense of literally the supernatural, but also unnatural things are going to occur and something evil is going to happen. Great line from Banquo, quite offensive. You should be women, when he's talking to the witches, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. Like, they're bearded women, weird sisters, you'll hear them referred to all sorts of things. Highly ambiguous and superstitious. The ambiguity of the witches, so the fact that like Banquo can't quite pin down, are you guys women? Are you real? Are you apparitions? Are you good witches or bad witches? The fact that they are so ambiguous amplifies how superstitious and how suspicious they are, and it feeds into that, like King James's idea. Imagine him sitting there watching the play thinking, yeah, witches are evil and bearded hags who, you know, who kill rats and tempt people to their doom. There's this constant chanting that they engage in, I think in Act 3, like I'll do, which doesn't necessarily lead to anything. We don't really know what they're doing while they're on stage. So there are a couple of stage directions, but not many, and so a lot of adaptations kind of go their own way with it. Also, if you think back to that diagram of the play from the Dr. Aiden video in the first couple of slides, after Act 4, Scene 1, we don't see the witches at all. And at that point, it's kind of like the inevitability has taken over, things are already in motion, everything's unraveling without the witches even needing to intervene anymore. There is also the character called Hecate. You only see her in 2 scenes, I think, but she is like the witch's boss that comes down and is like, what are you guys doing? Why are we messing with Macbeth? What's going on here? Everyone pretty much knows she's the goddess of witchcraft in mythology. She's also the goddess of crossroads, which I think is quite interesting because this ties into notions of destiny and fate and choice as well. So if we're thinking about if we're treating the witches as 4 kind of fields of female characters in the play, I'll focus on just Lady Macbeth and Lady Macduff first. Lady Macbeth we've already broken down. Ambitious, cunning, succumbs to her guilt. She's the only one who, I guess the witch is childless too, but we don't know that necessarily. But Lady Macbeth is defined by her childlessness. She becomes the wife to a king, and yet she has no heirs, which is literally the worst thing a woman could do back in the day. And debatably, she deserves what happens to her, in stark contrast to Lady Macduff, so Macduff's wife, who is basically just the perfect woman. You see her in, I think you only see her in the scene where she dies. You don't even see her previously, but she's just meant to be a delightful wife who's trying to keep her children safe. Even though both of them are very loyal, Lady Macduff is the only one who we look at as being like wifey material. Like, she's just a good person who's trying to do the right thing. Very, very sympathetic character, and she does not deserve to be so brutally murdered. Whereas Lady Macbeth, feeling guilty about what she's done, not to say she deserves her death, but you can look at Lady Macbeth's fate and say that your actions contributed to this, whereas Lady Macduff, completely innocent victim. It's also interesting to think about the overlap between Lady Macbeth and the witches, because both of them display, prove that they are capable of manipulating Macbeth's emotions. They're all accessories to murder, in my opinion, and they are all examples of women who are seeking and wielding power despite a patriarchal authority where men have the power and control. Witches, meanwhile, uniquely, they specifically want havoc and bad things to happen. Lady Macbeth wants power, and her ambitions have a particular direction, but the 3 witches are just like, we are just trying to cause carnage, and Macbeth is going to help us do that. They find power in that collective, all 3 of them. They're always seen together, but they also represent a kind of anarchic, like anarchy, just madness, no structure, no rules, only witches. And it's reflected, we'll get to this when we talk about the language, it's reflected in the way that they use language and how differently they speak from any of the other characters too. And Hecate, finally, she's similar to the witches in that she's a supernatural figure with ambiguous or uncertain motivations. However, Hecate kind of believes in order. She chastises the witches and tells them off for kind of toying with Macbeth when they give him the second round of prophecies and say, oh, don't worry about it until the trees come and get you. The witch is having a laugh, and Hecate's like, can you guys cut it out, please? But she has a more clear sense of right and wrong as opposed to the anarchy of the witches. She is like, Macbeth is too arrogant. He has a fatal flaw. We have to kind of show him the error of his ways, or, prove that he doesn't deserve power. So she's still very ambiguous and still very supernatural and weird and wacky, but she has more, she's a little bit more grounded in this is what should take place. And it kind of makes the supernatural elements all scarier, that she kind of comes in and is like, here's how we're going to manipulate things. Whereas the witches are just like, yeah, let's boil some stuff in a cauldron. So yeah, those are some other key talking points to think about for your essays. I will just have a quick look at, oops, sorry, gotta go back. Where are we? Okay, so, I quite like this little wheel of death that describes all of the various, murders that happen over the course of the play. But part of this whole theme of inevitability that I want to talk about is how these other themes all link together, and how the murder of Duncan, the guards or the servants that Macbeth kills, Banquo, Macbeth's friend, the Macduff family, Lady Macbeth dying by suicide, a couple of other miscellaneous ones in the middle there, and ultimately Macbeth being beheaded. So a whole bunch of cool stuff to talk about for thematic inevitability and the inevitability of the tragedy. First of all, ambition, probably the biggest theme in Macbeth. It is, I would argue that the play is suggesting that ambition is only an internal impulse that must be acted upon. Ambition in itself isn't evil. Shakespeare isn't saying that being ambitious is always bad. He's saying that it is an internal driving force, and sometimes that can motivate people to do bad things. Macbeth mentions that he has no spur to prick the sides of my intent. A spur is like a thing on cowboy boots that they would use to like giddy up a horse, you know? So Macbeth is saying, like, I don't have that spur, I don't have like a whip or a motivating, you know, jump start that is pricking me on and encouraging me to pursue my ambition. I only have ambition, and I don't really have that, you know, that spark that's going to force me to act on it. And my ambition overleaps itself and falls on the other side. So he's almost saying that he is like jumping up onto a horse, getting ready to do something, but he's jumping too far and going over it because his mind is like running away with these ideas. He doesn't have a practical way to approach things. And ironically, right as he's saying this, like, oh, you know, it's like I'm trying to get on a horse and I can't do it properly, I'm falling over it, Lady Macbeth interrupts him when he's saying this, because she is the spur. She is the one who is going to prick the sides of his intent and compel him to murder. Does this mean that ambition is masculine? At the time, again, stereotypically, ambition and power lust was seen as a more masculine trait, arguably still is. And Lady Macbeth is more severely punished for adopting this basically, both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are ambitious. Lady Macbeth cops it a bit worse for being ambitious, though. Both of them meet tragic ends, but Lady Macbeth in particular seems to be like, yeah, very harshly punished for all of this. They refer to each other as their dearest partners of greatness, but you could argue whether Macbeth or Lady Macbeth kind of are more exploitative in this relationship, where Lady Macbeth wants Macbeth to become king for the sake of, I guess, both of them, but ultimately, like, they're both acquiring power accordingly. But Macbeth also knows, I don't have a spur. I need someone to help me propel myself to greatness. Or murder, either way. Ambition is also something that is dangerous. It is to some extent chastised by Shakespeare, as in he's saying ambition can lead to bad things. Not always, but often, especially when it is exploited by others. Whether that's Lady Macbeth, the witches, or just, yeah, the inevitability of circumstance. Macbeth is quite a spiteful character. He's described as loving for his own ends, loving for where things can get him and what people can do for him, rather than just loving his wife. So he's quite, I guess, cunning, ambitious in that way. And both friends and foes, both Banquo and Hecate, the goddess, the head of the witches, both fields of characters in the play have lines where they see Macbeth's ambition as his fatal flaw, his hamartia, which hints that it's undeniable to the characters, and therefore to us as the audience as well, that Macbeth's ambition is going to lead to his undoing. If both the people who love and care about him and the people who wanted to see him punished are aware that this is exactly how things are going to go wrong. And is power an illusion is another question that I would encourage you to think about while studying. Who truly has the power in the play Macbeth? Is it Macbeth when he becomes king and he kind of positions himself in a way that he can get to, he steals the crown. He shouldn't have been king, but he was, because his ambition got him there. Does that mean he was powerful? Does he lose that power over the course of the play? Does he ever have power? Perhaps he only ever had the illusion of power. All themes and questions worth asking. Gender roles, and the two, again, very stereotypical, but this like binary spectrum for now of gender that we're going to talk about. This is all very much rooted in the 1600s Jacobean England ideas of what these terms represent. So with that disclaimer out of the way, masculinity, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to associate with power, bravery, performance in battles. That was a big thing in both Shakespeare's time and the characters' time, the 1100s of the play. Courage, moral righteousness, and deciding what is right and wrong was like a power that was ascribed to men and the church and the king and systems of power. And ultimately willpower and just being strong and tough. All things that belong to men, supposedly, in society. Meanwhile, women were more associated with subservience, being like the opposite of dominant, and succumbing to men, whether it be their fathers or their husbands, or their king or their landowner, whatever. On the plus side, they were kind of seen as more nurturing, maternalistic, gentle. Again, a lot of these, like, courage in and of itself isn't a bad thing. Gentleness in and of itself isn't a bad thing either. But this gender binary obviously creates a very rigid world whereby if a man does not adequately perform in battle, he feels like less of a man, which undermines him. If a woman cannot be maternal, cannot be a mother, she feels suddenly less feminine or whatever. Arguably, a lot of this still persists today in society. And another association of femininity that's directly a quote from the text: women are expected to be full of the milk of human kindness, which is a quote that Lady Macbeth says about Macbeth. And she says, I fear my husband is too full of the milk of human kindness to commit these crimes. So that's one of many hints that the rigid boundary between the two genders is broken down by the protagonist and his wife, Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth. But all of these traits also have a darker side, which is that, toxic masculinity, basically, or masculinity when it's dialed up to 11, can result in violence, cruelty, fearlessness, but in a bad way, like you're not afraid of what you could do to people or what you're capable of, and ruthlessness, which we 100% see in Macbeth. So when thinking about just the theme of masculinity for a minute, Macbeth is kind of like a masculine character who descends into this more ruthlessness category, where at the start he is brave, courageous. We see him succeeding after a battle. The king is like, I'm so grateful to you. Why don't you be Thane of Cawdor? You've done such a good job. Your performance in battle is so admirable. You're doing the right thing. And by the end of the play, he is massacring an innocent wife and child, or ordering their deaths, because once his ambition propels him onwards, his masculinity starts to it's like his testosterone levels get too high and he can't control himself anymore, and he is committing even more violent and cruel acts. Also, femininity can become a corrupted and sinister force that leads to manipulation. So the stereotype of the archetype of the woman as the temptress, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, that manipulates or convinces a man to sin for her own selfish desires. Deception, also associated with womanhood. Again, we're talking in stereotypes here. And a source of sin and evil. So the biblical story of Adam and Eve in the garden. Eve convinces Adam to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge. You don't have to know the Bible to analyze Macbeth, but just know that femininity, likewise with masculinity, has both neutral, if not positive, characteristics associated with it, some of which we see in particular characters in the play. So Macduff and Malcolm are examples of strong, in a good way, masculine characters. Lady Macduff, a good, strong feminine character. Maybe not strong, but good. But we also see Macbeth descend into becoming a much more ruthless man, and we see Lady Macbeth and the witches as examples of, I guess, toxic femininity, or examples of womanly characteristics that can be, corrupted and turned into a source of evil. Next major theme, I'll go through this one a little bit quicker, even though, yeah, I feel like we've talked about this all throughout too. Fate and free will. There is a cumulative, like a built up, everything adds and snowballs effect of Macbeth's ambition, the witch's prophecy, and Lady Macbeth's encouragement. That first image of like a little seed growing. The soil of Macbeth's character, the sun of the witch's prophecy that brings things to the surface, and Lady Macbeth watering the plant and being like, yes, grow my pretty, become an evil murderer. All of that is what leads to the tragedy. So, because of this collective, circumstantial setup, who has free will in this play? Does Macbeth make his own choices, or is he just doing what the witches hint him towards and what they not necessarily tell him to do, but the path that they lead him down? Does no one have free will? Is everyone just operating, as per fate and as their destiny is written in the stars? Is Macbeth a victim of fate or a victim of flaws? This might be a great essay topic to discuss, or a good, place to start your interpretations. Ultimately, the ambiguity of the prophecies. The fact that the prophecies that the witches give aren't, hey Macbeth, you are going to kill Duncan and then you're going to be king for about 2 weeks. The ambiguity is just, Macbeth, you are now Thane of Glamis, you will be Thane of Cawdor. Sorry, you were Thane of Glamis, you will be Thane of Cawdor, and then you will be king. And likewise, the next round of prophecies where they say, watch out for the trees, you're fine until the trees come and get you, and you're totally fine, no one born of a woman can kill you. The fact that those have ambiguities and loopholes suggest that Macbeth is the one who makes these come true. The witches aren't rocking up and telling you exactly, hey, like in Act 2, Scene 2, you're going to say this, 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 this. The witches are hinting at things in generalities, and Macbeth acting upon them, in my interpretation, is what leads to the events and the tragedy of the play. You don't necessarily have to argue that. I think that's the stronger interpretation, but ultimately it's up to you. The idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy is definitely a term that you should know. This means that because I tell you something, you act in a certain way, and that makes my prophecy that I gave you come true. So a prophecy affects your actions, and your actions therefore make the prophecy come true. If I, for example, were to tell you, hey, you, right now, you are going to get a 99 ATAR at the end of the year. I know for a fact, trust me, this is my prophecy, that's going to be your score 100%. Because you know that, you are going to act in a way that gets you that 99 ATAR, and then the prophecy comes true. Did I prophesize it, or did you, of your own volition, act in a way that made it come true? So the cycle of inevitability states that, or it kind of ties in with what we're saying about, a prophecy being self-fulfilling. Because Macbeth has an awareness and this knowledge that the witches give him, he acts in certain ways that make their prophecy come true. This is one of my favorite little cartoons about the play where the witch is like, Macbeth will be king, but Banquo's sons will also be king. Ooh, what's going to happen? And Banquo is like, hey friend, are you thinking what I'm thinking? And Macbeth is like, yes, murder. And Banquo is like, oh, that means our kids are going to get together, because like you're going to be king, and then you'll have a daughter, and my son will be king, or something's going to happen. Oh, how cute. And Macbeth's like, yeah, totally. I was thinking the same thing. So yeah, or from this very first, from the, scene 3, as soon as Macbeth and Banquo meet the witches, you start to notice the difference in their worldview about fate and free will. Because Banquo's like, oh, there's like a ton of different ways this could happen. If you can look into the grains of time and tell me how this is going to happen, maybe then I'll believe you, but I don't necessarily trust these witches. And Macbeth is like, this means I must kill. Already from the start, he has that seed planted in his mind. I think the last scene we'll talk about, and then I'll get into some essay structure stuff and some questions. The supernatural associated with disruptions of nature and being unnatural and disorder and anarchy. There's lots of irony and contradictions in their prophecies. So Banquo is not going to be king, but Macbeth will be king, but Banquo's sons will be king. Much like that question about, like, hang on, why did Macbeth become king? That's not a natural line of succession, and there's no obvious way where Banquo's not ever going to be in line to be king, but Macbeth will be somehow. And also Banquo's sons are somehow going to be king. Like, there's no real way through marriage or, foresight that that's going to end up happening. Beware Macduff, but also no woman born can harm you. The witches say, hey Macbeth, beware Macduff. And then they also say, no one born of a woman can harm Macbeth. So he has these contradictory things of like, Macduff's a danger, look out for him. But you can be fine, don't worry. If anyone's born of a woman, they can't harm you. And we know that's not the case. The witches are also constantly set apart in ways that I'll talk about language-wise and in appearance, because they're not women, they're not men, they have beards, but they're sisters. What does it all mean? This word, other, with like a capital O, is a term in literature studies for defining something as different from you. We see it a lot in books that are kind of defining cultures or setting aside, you know, England or America or colonial forces and people from other cultures who are othered and are discriminated against, and they're different because they look different to us, horrible stuff like that. The witches similarly are othered and defined as being different and gross and and far apart from who we are. So that dichotomy, that differencing, that othering, the process of making them seem different and strange, affects how we then think about the theme of the supernatural and its, you know, departure from our world. Their transgressions, the fact that they are unnatural and weird, is something that is, punished, and the moral transgressions of others are punished by supernatural forces. And I've said this already, lots of ambiguity to look out for. There's also apparitions that show up. Again, I won't delve in too far because this is just one particular scene, but they basically cause Macbeth to have a bunch of hallucinations by making things appear. So one of the things that appears is a line of basically a vision of all the future kings after Macbeth. And so they have like Fleance as one of them, and faces that remind Macbeth of Banquo. So it hints that that part of the prophecy will also come true, and that just, torments him further. Okay, a few quick notes on language features, and then I'll get to your questions. This is a play that is written predominantly in verse or meter, which are words that mean, it's the weird Shakespeare thing where there are 10 syllables on each line. I'll talk about what that looks like too. There's also sometimes prose or prosody, which is just normal paragraphs and sentence structure. Most of the time, verse and meter is reserved for people in the upper echelons, so kings and queens and all the royals, and most of the play is written in verse or meter, specifically iambic pentameter, which is a kind of meter that we'll go through that has certain rules about how many syllables there can be in a line, how many beats. And normally, prose is for the comic sans common folk, the basic people in society. It can also indicate a breakdown of a person's mental faculties because, you know, the fancy, impressive people can speak in verse, but, for example, when Lady Macbeth goes mad, she starts speaking in prose. That's something you can analyze in your essay because her ability to construct verse and meter basically breaks down and she starts just speaking with no structure whatsoever. So, iambic pentameter, I like that I can explain this in audio form because it's a lot clearer than just with words. An iamb is one unstressed syllable and one stressed syllable. And pentameter means there are 5 feet, 5 syllables, 5 iambs in a line. For example, this is a quote from the play, and this is one of the lines that is iambic pentameter because it has 10 syllables if you count them, and each one is unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. Then live, Macduff, what need I fear of thee. There's a natural pattern, and I'm obviously overemphasizing it, where the second syllable is the one that has more weight and more emphasis. Notice that if I tried to do the opposite, then live Macduff, what need I fear of thee, it sounds a lot weirder. Whereas, then live Macduff, what need I fear of thee? That's how the stress naturally falls in the line. That's iambic pentameter, right? For example, Macbeth. They hailed him father to a line of kings. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown. All of these are da-dun, 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 da-dun. 10 syllables, da-dun, da-dun, that unstressed, stressed pattern. That's what it means. Why do we care? Why does this matter? Why do you have to know this? Because sometimes it draws your attention in particular ways. I loved talking about this in my essays. So for example, this is when Macbeth is saying, the witches gave him this prophecy. They said Banquo is going to be the father to a line of kings. But they're saying, I will have a fruitless crown. I'm going to be king, but I'm not going to have children who will be king. What does that mean? I have a barren scepter. What's going on? And at the end he says, oh, well, I guess then if I'm going to be king and Banquo's sons are going to be king, then everything I do is helping Banquo's sons. For them, the gracious Duncan I have murdered. I am committing a crime and killing a king, and it's going to benefit Banquo's sons. That starts to kind of eat away at his mind as well. Like, why am I doing all this? What's my purpose? For them, the gracious Duncan I have murdered. The iambic structure forces the actor and us as the audience to notice the weight that is placed on this particular word. Meanwhile, the witches do not speak in iambic pentameter. They speak in a totally different form of meter. I'll quickly explain this. It is trochaic tetrameter, which has trochees instead of iambs, which mean it's stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. So it's the total opposite of an iamb. For example, I of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat. So the emphasis is on the opposite syllable. Again, it would be weird if I were to say I of newt and toe of frog, because that's not how. I of newt and. Yeah, right. It sounds odd to be placing the emphasis as though these were iambs instead of trochees. Again, you don't have to know a whole lot about each of these individual words. I'm just giving you these so that the vocab words are things you're aware of. And tetrameter means there are 4 syllables, there are 4 feet, meaning there are 8 syllables in a line. So double, double, toil and trouble. I always think of that as a Harry Potter song, but yeah, 8 syllables, right? If it is 8 syllables, it is trochaic tetrameter. Again, you don't have to pronounce it, you just have to know how to spell it for your essays if you're using it. If there are only 7 syllables, I of newt and toe of frog, then it is incomplete trochaic tetrameter, or catalectic is the technical term for it. Don't stress too much about it, but just know that if you see it being 7 syllables, that's fine, it's also a thing. And it kind of creates this missing sense where you expect it to be an 8-line, double, double, toil and trouble, I of newt and toe of frog, and there's like almost a phantom odd beat where you're missing something, and that contributes to our sense of unease as well. So yeah, hopefully this is also a good slide that you can come back to and basically use this as a reference point if you need to talk about verse and Shakespeare's language throughout your essays. A few quick literary features, some symbols, blood, very obvious one, having blood on your hands means you feel guilty. Ghosts are like haunting consequences for your past actions. Macbeth sees Banquo because he kills Banquo, and so the ghost appears to him. Death is also an interesting one. Death can mean a victory of ideology. In Shakespeare plays, if one character kills another character, it's because that character's worldview is more powerful and sometimes better, sometimes just stronger than someone else's. So for example, Duncan is a very trusting king. Macbeth is very manipulative and he knows how to be ambitious and get what he wants. Macbeth is therefore more powerful than Duncan, hence why he's able to kill him. But Macduff is a good, strong, loyal person. Macduff is able to kill Macbeth because those are the values that Shakespeare is saying are more powerful. It's like, oh, love and the power of friendship triumphs over Macbeth's evil, right? However, most of Macbeth's murders, I've been talking about like Macbeth murders Banquo and so, most of the time he's getting other people to do his dirty work for him. With the exception of King Duncan, Macbeth doesn't kill anyone, he just commands other people to kill people. Duncan is the only death that happens at his own hand. After that, there's this constant diffusion and trying to like spread out responsibility so that, oh, it's not me, I just told those murderers to go and kill Banquo and Fleance. One more quick thing, motif of father and sons. So there are lots of pairs in the play where like Banquo is the father, Fleance is the son, King Duncan, Prince Malcolm, Macduff and his unnamed son, and there's some other characters. First of all, Macbeth doesn't have a son. I've already talked about why that's notable for a king. But also, Macbeth kills Banquo, Macbeth kills Duncan, he kills Macduff's son, and he kills young Siward. Macbeth kills one in each pair, leaving these two fatherless and leaving these two childless. All of the, like, it's basically like Macbeth is killing every single example of families and fathers and sons throughout the whole play, because his actions are like tearing the fabric of society apart, and that's one of the reasons why Macbeth is so evil. It also means that after all 4 of those deaths, even though Siward isn't a major character, you don't have to stress about that too much, in all 4 of these deaths, there's someone left to mourn. Banquo dies, and Fleance has to pick up the pieces knowing that his father was murdered by a friend. Malcolm is like, my dad is dead, and also the killer stole the crown from me. Macduff mourns his son, Siward mourns his son. No one will mourn Macbeth. And that's almost another indication that society is returning to the status quo and order is restored to the kingdom. Yeah, all of these other deaths were tragedies, but Macbeth had it coming and no one's going to be sad about it, basically. This isn't super important, but Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, in the same way we don't see the witches after Act 4, Scene 1, we don't see these two on stage together at all after Act 3, Scene 4, almost halfway through the play, which signifies their, splintering off into their different tragic fates. Pathetic fallacy, this is a technique I might let you guys look up. We go into quite a bit of detail in it in the text guide for this, for Macbeth, but it's a structural feature whereby the outer world reflects the inner world. So like I said, it's stormy and horrible, and the horses are eating each other when Duncan is killed because society is unraveling at the seams. And Macbeth also explicitly says, I wish the night were darker when I was, he pleads for the night to be dark so that he can commit the crimes in the dead of night and no one will see them, because the deed is so evil and dark that it has to be done on a really evil and dark night. I'm going to leave dramatic irony for later. Basically, it is when the audience is aware of something and the other characters are not. So, for example, we know that Macbeth is responsible for the death of Duncan, even though the characters can kind of take a while to catch up with all of this. I've kind of, sometimes this is for comic effect. In this play, it is for dramatic effect, meaning it compels us to keep watching because we understand that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are guilty. But also it's, a very common technique used by Shakespeare, worth analysing and looking up if you want to discuss it in your own essays. I'm going to leave soliloquies actually for a subsequent lecture series. I've listed the important soliloquies here. Lady Macbeth has 2 of them. Macbeth has 4. Again, you don't have to worry about understanding all of these now. Focus on just getting the broad plot and characters down pat, and you can come back to these later. But I've given you a general overview of like the most important points that happen through each of them. So come back to that slide after you've gotten through those in class. I'm also going to leave I had a couple of exercises here. This is like an example of how I would annotate a moment in the play. I won't explain all this because I want to get to your questions, but basically, whether you're physically annotating, whether you're writing your own notes, think about the different ways in which you can pull apart meaning. Don't just focus on translating the Shakespeare, because you can read like a no fear edition or another an edition that explains all the language in the play if you need. Focus on finding meaning. Focus on how these different allusions, if you're looking for specific techniques, or just the meaning of particular words. So Macbeth is, after the murder, thinking about how guilty he feels, and he says, oh my god, what hands are these? About his own hands. So he's not asking whose hands are they, he's asking what are they, because he's so depersonalized, he can't even associate with the act or the person who has done this horrible thing. Another example that I will leave you guys to look over in your own time, and this final slide has an example of an essay checklist that you can use, which hopefully might field some of the questions that are here. But basically, these are the important things that you need to tick off in order to write an effective essay. This isn't conclusive, and there's a lot more that you can do within each one of these, but hopefully this is a useful starting point as you, later in the year, start to think about